Fentanyl. It could be hiding anywhere, including in your house, including in your medicine cabinet, or maybe at a friend's house when you're hanging out, playing games, and get offered a pill. Don't take chances. If a drug didn't come from a pharmacy directly to you, you can find fentanyl using a simple strip you can pick up at your local pharmacy. Don't take it until you test it, because fentanyl can be hiding anywhere. Brought to you by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Mental Disabilities.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. And if you need to get a hold of me, I'm the president of Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. You could email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Very excited for my guest today, David McGrath from New England. You can hardly tell. And his book is called Obsessed, A Survivor's Quest to Find Justice for the Lost Boys of New England. The book just came out. The ink's not even dry yet. We're lucky to get him here, though. There's such short notice. You can find him on Twitter and Instagram at DaveM11 Bravo, Bravo. That's his call signs, I guess. Keep an eye out, too. He's doing a whole 6-part series or 7-part series on Seth Rich on his podcast. We're going to be looking forward to that. But if you want to meet him in person on January 19th and February 24th in Providence Library in Providence, Rhode Island at 150 Empire Street, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So get there early. Maybe you can catch a beer with him afterwards. Mr. David McGrath, are you there?
I'm here, Ed. Thanks so much for having me, man. When Ed Opperman calls, no matter how short the notice is, you show up. So I'm glad to be here, brother. Merry Christmas.
Yeah, unless you owe me money, right? Then everybody, no one picks up my calls, it seems. But Mr. McGrath, tell us about yourself. Who is David McGrath?
Wow, if I wasn't married and I was giving you like a 30-second elevator pitch on why you should hang out with me, it would be more of like, I'm someone who's kind of, I have a real mistrust of just about everything that's told to me. And I know for the most part that all official narratives that I hear about things are more than likely lies. I am obsessed with the truth and sort of the soft underbelly of the world, which is the real world. And, in my heart personally, I was a victim of childhood sexual abuse. I'm very open about that. And I'm obsessed, as the book says, with understanding the apparatus that existed in New England, predominantly in Boston area, Providence, Rhode Island area, and beyond in the 1970s, and what happened exactly to all these missing kids and how it relates to things that happened to me in the early 1990s and other children around this region, and what exactly attracted all of these people to this area at that time, and why is it not covered anywhere? I mean, you just don't see any coverage of this incredible time in the history of these states. So at my core, I'm just somebody who likes to tell stories and likes to, debunk theories and rumors and innuendo and tell the truth. That's my elevator pitch to your audience, Ed.
Yeah. How old are you? Because the 70s is before your time then.
70s was absolutely before my time. I was born in 1984.
Gotcha.
I am 40 years old this year, just beginning to get gray and a little chubby. I'm a father of 2 boys. And, yeah, it was absolutely before my time. The reason why I became interested in these cases is because, like I said, most of the abuse that happened to me was predominantly men in the early 1990s, between like 1990 and 1993. I had actually seen a documentary years later, around 2012, called Have You Seen Andy? It was by a local woman named Melanie Perkins McLaughlin. It was one of those nights, Ed, that we've all kind of had where I was up late, and, I had a cold. I'm flipping through the channels at 2 a.m. I'm rustling around, and I fell upon this HBO documentary, Have You Seen Andy? And it was about a missing boy from Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is north of Boston, about 30 minutes from where I grew up. And, this boy had been missing since 1976. And this young woman had done a documentary on it because she was actually present that day that he went missing. She was a schoolmate of his. She was friendly with him. They were almost like little boyfriend and girlfriend. And she came back to Lawrence all these years later after working in Hollywood and made a documentary about it, and made a documentary about the sex offenders who were present the day that this boy disappeared from the Higgins Memorial Pool in Lawrence. And the minute that I heard that there was 5 sex offenders present that day at the pool, I set on my own kind of course to understand what exactly happened that day to that little boy, because, as a victim myself at one point, you feel sort of like a special kinship. It's almost like being in the same fraternity, or, when I see somebody who is in the military, or, perhaps you in the same union, there's like a kinship there. You want to help each other, it's like a secret handshake kind of thing. So as soon as I saw that really set the course for me investigating this. And then, of course, I noticed there was scores of other missing kids in that area. There's a pedophile network, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that's really kind of how this started for me, and how I became interested in these cases that happened, and some of them 20 years before I was born.
Yeah. Hence the title, Obsessed, a survivor's quest to find justice for the lost boys of New England. So, David McGrath, a little bit about your background now. You're a private investigator. How'd you get involved in that? I guess you were in the military, too, with this Dave M. 11 Bravo, right?
Sure. So I read a book called Tips to Becoming a Private... No, I did read your book, Ed, and it still sits on the bookshelf, as I was saying to you earlier. It's kind of weird. I kind of was aimless, like many sexual abuse victims, or, I kind of was really aimless in my younger years. I barely graduated high school. I was really kind of a screwed up kid. I didn't have good grades. I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't really have much going for me in my life. So then, of course, 9/11 happened, which we all, of a certain age, remember being like, the biggest event in our lives. This was like this huge thing that is going to mark time from here on out, and the very next day, I just told my dad, like, hey, I'm going to go join the military now. I mean, and I remember getting to the recruiting station on 9/12 or 9/13 and seeing just lines of people trying to get in Boston to get in the Army or the Marine Corps or the Navy, whatever they were doing. And, I just said, okay, I'll do 4 years and, maybe deploy to Afghanistan or Iraq or what is, I don't think Iraq kicked off then, but, so I ended up staying in for a long time, 15 years in total, and, deploying to Afghanistan, seeing some combat. And, I got out in 2017 and again, kind of aimless. I worked in every part of the prison system. I worked in a private prison for a long time. I worked in a sheriff's department. I worked at a state prison, Florida DOC. And, one of my leaders in the prison system was like, a captain had grabbed me and said, I'm leaving. I'm going to a private investigation company. You should think about getting out of here too, because any correctional officers who are listening to the show know that it's got to be the worst job in America. and I mean that. There's people out there digging graves who look down on you when you're. I've never met a happy CO. Let's put it that way. So I said, sure, I'll give it a shot, and I got the licensing done and got hired on. And I tell you, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. It's a very independent job. You have to be a self-starter, but the amount of things that you can do in PI work really keeps it interesting, as you know, Ed. I went to college and I studied digital forensics. I still do it now. I still study, still in school, never stop because the government pays for it. So I'm going to keep milking that as long as I can. And so now, I've learned all about computer crimes, how to pull, forensic data, metadata, it's just anything you can do to keep yourself, to make sure that this work that comes down the pike, you're able to do it, So, been a PI for a bit, absolutely love it, work for a large firm. Probably will retire out of it. I'll probably do this for the next 20 years of my life and then, I don't know, go chase golf balls or something. So.
Yeah, good luck with that, yeah. Okay. So then this kid, Andy, I guess he goes missing up there in New England from a swimming pool. Give us the background on who was Andy?
So Andy was a 10-year-old boy from Lawrence, Massachusetts, who disappeared on August 22nd, 1976. from the Higgins Memorial Pool in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So to this date, 2024, as we sit here at Christmas time, he's never been found. There's been no trace of this young boy. I initially became, really kind of obsessed with, what all happened in the aftermath of this case that allowed it to go cold for 6 decades, basically now. And if there were 5 sex offenders at that pool, did they know each other? Had someone seen something? Had there been witness statements? And it turns out that, of course, they had. Yeah. And they actually had a great suspect for the case. And the man's name was Wayne Chapman. And Wayne Chapman came from upstate New York. So that fact set the course for really all of this last 10 years of investigation into this. Because once I started looking at Wayne Chapman, I started to ask myself the question of how a guy from Jamestown, New York, which I've been to multiple times, 6 hours away from Providence, Rhode Island, how did he end up living in Providence and stalking young boys in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is, 30 miles away, maybe an hour's drive time, from Providence to Lawrence. So how he got there was more important than maybe anything to me. So, Wayne Chapman is the main suspect. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that he did it. Multiple witnesses have him there that day. Multiple witnesses have him coming back the next day during the massive search for Andy, asking questions of the lifeguards of, hey, what's going on with this missing kid, et cetera, et cetera. Chapman had actually done something that many criminals do. He confessed to the crime twice and then recanted, and unfortunately they were never able to just get any evidence to take Chapman down fully for the murder. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's unsolved. It's one of those crimes that's unsolved but solved. There's really no doubt that it was him. So as I looked into it more, I realized that Wayne Chapman had actually no connection to Providence. I should back up a little bit. I mentioned Providence because Wayne Chapman lived in Providence. And I became obsessed with the idea of how Chapman got to Providence because he had no family connection there. His entire family, brothers, mother and father, lived still in upstate New York. So how in the hell did this guy get to Providence, settle down, work as a janitor at Miriam Hospital, which is the main big hospital in Providence? And, he didn't wake up in the morning and throw darts at a map. I just became fascinated with how he came there. Well, as it turns out, I did a bunch of FBI FOIA requests and poured through thousands of documents. And as it turns out, Providence was the child porn capital of the United States in the 1970s. And Roy DeMeo, who was a New York crime boss in the early 1970s, 1971, basically pushed his child pornography pushing business down to Providence to where mob boss Raymond Patriarca ran all of the child pornography in Providence. So as I dug deeper into the mob activity here, it became clear to me that Wayne Chapman had been tapped to be a low-level producer of child pornography. And how he did that was he would grab boys, he would isolate them, take them into the woods, snap pictures of them in suggestive poses during even in the middle of the act. And I know it's disgusting for your viewers and it's for your listeners. It's not a happy story. It's a despicable, disgusting story, but it's one that needs to be told. And when he would isolate these kids like Andy, he would then go back to his apartment. There's a man who worked as a janitor, made around $3 an hour. He had the most high-tech, state-of-the-art for the time camera equipment. He had a dark room at 178 Linwood Avenue where he lived in Providence. Triple-decker, he lived on the 3rd floor. And he would take these photos, develop them on his own, and then they would go and circulate amongst the pedophile community in Providence. And I know I just said a lot there, Ed, so if you want me to stop, you want to ask something, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Lawrence, Massachusetts, my understanding that's like a low-income, high-crime area?
No doubt. Your understanding would be absolutely correct. In fact, Andy Puglisi lived in a housing project that overlooked the pool called the Stadium Housing Project. To this day, it is a mill town, which is it's a high-crime, sort of working-class neighborhood. north of Boston, 25 minutes up 95, probably almost into New Hampshire. So yeah, your understanding is absolutely correct. It was very, very working class, low income at the time, and remains that way to this day.
And you said that Chapman lived in Providence. How far is that from Lawrence to Providence?
Yeah, you're probably thinking, you got to go through Boston. So on a bad day, you could be looking at a 2-hour drive. On a day like today, you're probably looking an hour every day. And, we'll call it conservatively an hour. So Chapman would have had to have driven from his house in Providence to Lawrence. And the thought was amongst the police, and I've interviewed every detective that basically, especially the main one, Albert Mintz, who is predominant in the book, who was the Providence police sex crimes detective who was involved in the chat.
Fentanyl. It could be hiding anywhere, including in your house, including in your medicine cabinet, or maybe at a friend's house when you're hanging out, playing games, and get offered a pill. Don't take chances. If a drug didn't come from a pharmacy directly to you, you can find fentanyl using a simple strip you can pick up at your local pharmacy. Don't take it until you test it, because fentanyl can be hiding anywhere. Brought to you by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Mental Disabilities.
In case, believed that he just stalked highways. He believed that he just drove up and down the highways every single day and got off at certain exits, but I don't believe that at all, Ed. I believe that Wayne Chapman knew somebody in the projects there in Lawrence, and he only went to places in which he had an in the neighborhood with another pedophile. In fact, about 10 minutes, I wouldn't even call it 10, probably 5 minutes away from the stadium housing projects, there was a convenience store that was known and had been shut down and been in the newspaper for selling child pornography in the storefront. Just think about that now in 2024 if you saw that. But in the 1970s, in the early to mid-70s, that was a thing. That happened here. And it had been shut down for peddling child pornography, and they were known as major pushers, and this is, 5 minutes from Andy's house. And the two store owners of that store in Lawrence who had been pushing that child pornography and been shut down, selling it, producing it, getting it out there, were both guys from Providence. So the Providence-Lawrence connection just never ends in that city. And could I ever connect them to Chapman? No, but it was an interesting little tidbit of the amount of activity coming down from Providence into that little working-class neighborhood and the housing projects there is incredible. It's impossible to overlook it.
Yeah, I had some connections up in Maine, so I used to travel up to Maine all the time. And I was surprised to find out how much of that kind of child abuse, sexual battery, and all that kind of stuff was going up there. Now, this fellow, Wayne Chapman, what was his background? Did he have a criminal record? What was his connection to the organized crime in New York?
Chapman, I think a lot of people believe that pedophiles are sort of brought up and they come from these sort of abusive, households where it's like, the people under the stairs type thing. And it's just not the case. It's actually, oftentimes it's the opposite. I couldn't find anything in Chapman's background outside of a little bit of abuse from his father, who was an alcoholic. I've been up there multiple times. I've talked to scores of people who knew the Chapman family. Hell, I stood in his childhood bedroom, Ed. It was sort of a cookie cutter sort of way to live, bedroom community in Jamestown. Very, very quiet, upstate New York town. It's one of those towns where if you told me it was the middle of Kentucky, if I just parachuted in, I wouldn't know. I mean, it just seemed like a very rural area. And I don't know what his connection was in New York. I'm going to give you an honest answer. I don't know. I could never, in all these years, pin down how Chapman got out of Jamestown, other than he had been offending against young kids his entire life. It started with his own brothers in the early ages, 6 and 7 years old. It moved on to offending at 10, 11 years old. Eventually, he was crossing the border into Canada, looking at child pornography in those stores in Toronto. And It moved back when he went into Pennsylvania and Ohio, crossing over from upstate New York, where he had gotten in trouble in 1967 for isolating a young boy when he told him, he basically used the ruse of, I have a paper route for you, meet me here at a specific time. He took the boy out, raped him. Excuse me for the language, I apologize.
That's okay, but the thing is, all these brushes with the law, but any arrests, any convictions, what's going on with this guy?
Yeah, he eventually ended up doing 1 year in prison in a Pennsylvania state reformatory. In the book, I print out his handwritten register of the day that he signed in. He actually ended up doing just about 1 year to the day. And then in the early 70s, he kind of disappears from 68 to 70. 69, 70, he's in trouble again. He's put on probation. He's put into a mental institution, Rwanda State Hospital, which is upstate New York. Gets out again, no jail time. And then somehow between 1970 and 1974, he gets married. He moves down to Florida with a young woman who has 2 young children. Those boys accused him of rape as well. He's basically, he's isolating these kids away from their parents, from their mom, who was a single mom, who she ended up staying in contact with him too. She was still making prison phone calls to him as late as 2014, 15. So whatever became of those boys, I don't know. They end up getting divorced, and then he ends up in Providence. And what connection, how did he know what was going on in Providence at the time? I'll never know, Ed. We'll just never know.
When you look at these guys, when you look at these guys, they're dancing between the raindrops their whole life. You know what I mean? The brush here, brush there, probation, bullshit. Sorry, I did it myself. You know what I'm talking about? But is there an original case where, he caught a case and he became an informant, and that's why he coasted through life after that? Did you find something like that?
I did not. There's a little bit of different. I talk about so many different guys in this pedophile network. In this book, it's 300 and something pages of just Wayne Chapman being at the center, and here's all the branches of it. And one of them was an FBI informant for the New York Police Department, and he was also a priest. His name was Cornelius Otero, and he had gone down for raping a couple boys in New York at a summer camp. And I believe on some level, somewhere, he was connected to Wayne Chapman through Connecticut. But finding that one case for the New York State Police or the local Jamestown Police where I could pinpoint this is when Chapman became an informant, I couldn't. But what I really believe happened is that Chapman had committed so many crimes around Jamestown and surrounding states that he just needed to get the hell out of there. And he needed to go as far as possible. And how he ended up in Providence, or why anybody would pick Providence to live in at that time or now, is beyond me. I just think that underground pedophile network, Ed, was enough for him to say, okay, I know that there's things going on here. I can make money. I can be outfitted. I mean, he's a guy who made $4 an hour. He had camera equipment, a vehicle, a dark room. In the 1970s, I mean, that was state of the art. Nobody had that unless you had money, and Wayne Chapman certainly did not. So I believe he was outfitted.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what about on the day that Andy goes missing? What brought Chapman to the attention of police?
It was weeks later. He was not brought to the attention of police that day. It was weeks later, driving through the New York State Thruway, as I chronicle in the book. It was September 1976. Chapman was heading back home, I presume, through the New York State Thruway. He was pulled over by a sergeant from the New York State Police called Tony Vatter. Vatter pulled up to the vehicle, got him out of the car, and noticed that this man had a bevy of boys' pictures on his dashboard of an old van in suggestive poses. So this is a guy, Wayne Chapman, who's traveling the highway with pictures, Polaroids, all spread out on his dashboard of young boys in various states of undress. So, of course, the state trooper, put the cuffs on Chapman and did an inventory of the vehicle. They found a starter pistol. They found maps. They found hand-drawn maps of different areas in Lawrence. They found reels and reels of child pornography on those old camera reels from the 1960s that you'd always see in movies. They found pedophile magazines. They found writing. What they found was a sock, one sock that looked like a schoolgirl sock. And that morning, Andy left his home to go over to the pool. His mother had been picking on him because Andy actually grabbed a pair of his sister's socks and threw them on to head over there. And his mom vividly remembered saying, hey, don't wear your sister's socks out. But so one sock was found in Wayne Chapman's back of his van. So what happened was the New York State Police took pictures of some of the pictures of the young boys and sent a teletype out around the country to different police agencies. And there was a man, detective, who was a sex crimes detective in Providence named Albert Mintz, who still lives to this day in sunny Florida, who saw the picture, one picture in particular that was taken at the Roger Williams State Park in Cranston, Rhode Island. Saw it, recognized one of the statues behind the young boys, and decided to take a look at it. He called up. They gave him Chapman's name. He headed over to where Wayne Chapman lived and started digging through his trash. Meanwhile, Chapman is now in custody in New York, but Albert Mintz is in Providence digging through his trash, and he's finding receipts from different towns: Brockton, Massachusetts; Lawrence, Massachusetts; areas out western Massachusetts, central Massachusetts. So he said, this guy's a traveler. He's all over the place. And then he started questioning the neighborhood kids, and I won't use the language that he used here, but basically the kids had told him that some of them had been up to that third floor apartment, and a lot of them had stories to tell. He had been molesting some young boys in the neighborhood. Excuse me. Chapman had created a 4-H club in Providence that had no affiliation to the national 4-H, and he had been basically taking young boys out and isolating some of them and raping them. He had taken boys out into the highway in the back of his van, raping them around the city, taking boys out for different expeditions at Lincolnwood State Park, which is a local park that a lot of kids use, Boy Scouts, etc., in Rhode Island, raping them there. The pictures started coming into view for Mintz, and he knew he needed to go out and interview Chapman in New York. He had specifically the Brockton receipt, Massachusetts, and the Lawrence receipt were very important to him because he knew that he had a pedophile on his hands. He also knew that there were 2 missing boys in those towns. There was Brockton, David Lewison, which I chronicle in the book, and of course Andy Puglisi. So that's how Chapman got into custody.
Imagine the arrogance of this guy driving along with all that stuff in plain view,
Well, I did theorize in the book that it's either arrogance, stupidity, or, as I've seen over my years of research into these guys, they really just can't help themselves.
Yeah.
They just can't. Imagine being so sick that you can't even take a drive without having pictures of these boys spread out over your dashboard.
Yeah, they want to get caught sometimes, too. They just have so much guilt. Now, what about, did he have an attorney? When they first pick him up, they're holding him for something, I guess, what, for the pictures they're holding him for?
Yeah, they basically actually found that starter pistol.
Okay.
And those starter pistols are not harmful to anybody. They're the kind of pistols that you use at the beginning of like a race or something like that.
Yeah, but you weren't allowed to have those in New York in the 70s, yeah.
Exactly. He broke firearms laws in New York for that time frame, so they were able to hold him on that. I think he ended up doing 3 days for that. But what happened is Mintz flew into New York, and he got him to basically, admit to the rapes of the young boys.
Really?
There was Mintz had used a ruse on him where he basically said, look, this is a mob-run city. As it was in Providence, it is the most corrupt city in America. It's the smallest capital city. Rhode Island is the smallest state. But we could go on forever and ever about the corruption in the city of Providence. I mean, they had a mayor, Buddy Cianci, who was elected, did federal prison time for being corrupt, almost a decade, got out and was reelected right away. So that's all you need to know about Providence. Yeah. So when he ended up, basically Mintz, said to him, look, this is a mob-run city, and you're out here raping little Italian boys. What do you think is going to happen to you in prison? I think you need to go to a state hospital. and Chapman did admit to it. Mintz did question him about Andy Puglisi, about the sock. They had the mother come up from Lawrence to the Providence Police Department. She ID'd the sock as being Andy's. And Chapman, he confessed to it and then recanted his confession. And unfortunately, the sock was lost. So that sock never saw DNA technology. It never saw, any of these advances we have today with genealogy and things of that nature because the police just lost it. So that's probably the main reason why Andy Puglisi has never, and his family have never gotten justice. But there's other factors there too. The body was never found. I have different theories about what happened with the body. I've certainly written a lot about it. In any event, Chapman admits to those rapes. He admits to two rapes the year prior in Lawrence in 1975. He was at the pool a year earlier before Andy's disappearance, and 2 boys had been raped in the woods. Chapman admitted to those, and he gets sentenced to 15 to 30 years consecutively and basically never sees the light of day again until the late 2000 teens before he died. So unfortunately, for the Puglisi family, there was no justice on this side. There was another disappearance of a young boy, which, of course, I talk about in depth in the book, and that was of David Lewison in Brockton. Wayne Chapman had also admitted to taking that little boy and behind his house and to the cemetery, which was adjacent to his house, raping him and then leaving him for dead. Now, Lewison was the son of a very prominent attorney in town, a man who had actually ran for mayor and had come very close to winning it. And the police had believed that one of David Lewison's father's political opponents maybe had gotten involved. Maybe it was a guy who Lewison had prosecuted, looking for retribution. So for years and years, that case went cold until 1980, where Chapman was already in jail for many, many years by then. David Lewison's body was found in a steamer trunk on a property that was being renovated on a multifamily unit in town in Brockton. And a 20-year-old formerly abused boy named David O'Meara was the one who found him. And there's been much speculation over the years whether or not Wayne Chapman actually led police quietly to that body. And it's unfortunately something that we'll never know. There's just so much mystery as to those 2 disappearances, and specifically that Brockton one. Just how did they find that body? How did they have and you just, anybody.
Fentanyl. It could be hiding anywhere, including in your house, including in your medicine cabinet, or maybe at a friend's house when you're hanging out, playing games, and get offered a pill. Don't take chances. If a drug didn't come from a pharmacy directly to you, you can find fentanyl using a simple strip you can pick up at your local pharmacy. Don't take it until you test it, because fentanyl can be hiding anywhere. Brought to you by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Mental Disabilities.
Anybody who knows my work knows that I have no problem questioning police and questioning anybody, or calling or showing up, or, I'm not really scared of that. And I just never been able to get any answers of how the police got that body. I'll never know. I believe in my heart that Wayne Chapman basically cut a deal. He could get out of prison and get over to the state mental institution at Bridgewater, which housed all the sex offenders and the very violent sex criminals, and he could have an easier life. So that's what I think happened, Ed.
We're talking to private investigator David McGrath. The book is called Obsessed, A Survivor's Quest to Find Justice for the Lost Boys of New England. And you can hear the way he tells the story. So you know right away if you get the book. The guy's a great storyteller. I forgot to mention before, he's got a Substack where he writes all his articles. You can find it, write 1 or 2 articles a week, he was telling me before. And you want to meet him in person, January 19th and February 24th at the Providence Library at 150 Empire Street at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And you can also find him on Twitter and Instagram at DaveM11Bravo. Now, this character, Cornelius Otero, you think he's a key player in all this?
sometimes in any investigator will tell you, and I'm sure you can say the same, Ed, you run into things that may mean anything or may mean nothing, right? It may mean everything or may mean nothing. And, I even write in the book often, I would sometimes write, like, I don't know why I chased this for so long, guys. I just want to let you know, and the reason why I became aware of Cornelius Otero is this. There was a young couple in 2005 who bought their dream home in the town of West Hartford, Connecticut. And they were going to renovate the downstairs basement. The home had been owned by a pretty prominent doctor. He was actually the head of endocrinology at one point in a Connecticut hospital, and he worked with children. He, in fact, would send home handwritten notes to parents asking to have their kids come in for growth studies, things like that. This doctor had the biggest stash of homemade child pornography that the United States has ever seen in the wall of his downstairs basement, finished basement. It was in a wall. When they knocked the wall down, 50,000 reels fell out, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of homemade pictures. This doctor had been the most prolific producer of child pornography that the United States has ever seen. And the doctor's name is Dr. George Reardon, Reardon. To this day, the Connecticut State Police has pictures of men that Reardon photographed abusing children. So there was other people involved, and Reardon had basically had a dark room, much like Wayne Chapman in his home, and also his vacation home in upstate New York, very close to where Wayne Chapman grew up. And once I had started pounding pavement in Jamestown, many people had brought up to me the fact that Wayne Chapman was connected to a doctor in town who had moved somewhere in New England. That's just what I kept hearing. So I kept hearing it over and over again. I eventually found the story of Reardon and all of that child porn that had fallen out of the walls in that poor couple's house when they were just trying to renovate. And once I started digging into Reardon, I had gotten a tip that George Reardon was best friends with a chaplain who worked at a hospital in Connecticut. This chaplain had come from somewhere, and then I had learned that Cornelius Otero had been sent to that hospital in Connecticut from New York to sort of get himself right, as the Catholic Archdiocese often did with problem priests, as we've learned through Boston Globe Spotlight, things like that. So Cornelius Otero was in New England, and he was best friends and workmates with one of the most prolific pedophiles that the world has ever known. So I found that to be really interesting and beyond what I would say coincidence, Ed.
Oh, yeah, this is great work, man. I got to tell you, I have so many authors on here. You ask them, hey, did you follow up on this? Did you follow up on that? I say, oh, no. This guy's in the guy's bedroom, childhood bedroom.
Yeah, it's impossible to talk about this book, 9 years of my life, in 1 hour. There's just so much, I was going to split it into 2 volumes because I was like, what am I going to do, right? War and Peace here, we're talking about child murder, but it's just a story that has so many tentacles. I'll give you another one for your audience, an offshoot story here. About 15 minutes from Lawrence in the town of Revere, Massachusetts, very close to Boston's Logan Airport, there's a famous racetrack there called Suffolk Downs. There was, in April of 1977, there was a raid on a home owned by an advertising executive, 242 Mountain Avenue in Revere. For your Bostonian listeners, they're going to know this area quite well. It's a lovely area close to Revere Beach where a lot of us probably grew up hanging out. Anyway, the locals had noticed that a man named Richard Paluzzo had a multitude of men coming in and out of his house at all hours of the night. In fact, there had been a lot of little boys and all the way up to teenagers who had been seen in the summer months outside smoking cigarettes, drinking Budweiser with those classic red cans that all of us can easily spot from a mile away. Anyway, long story short, very close to where Andy Puglisi had disappeared and David Lewison, a sex ring was broken up with these young men who had been basically taking boys from, I've seen the court documents, Ed. It's just the most despicable stuff you'll ever read. These kids were foster kids. These kids were kids without families. These kids were the lowest common denominator of our society. They were just forgotten about. And this guy, Richard Palooza, was taking them in and basically selling them to men, prominent men. And I'm talking about the headmasters at prominent schools. I'm talking one gentleman was a head pediatrician at a Boston hospital running a whole program for kids. And they were showing up in the logs of coming in to Palooza's residence and having sex with young boys. And what connection does it have to Chapman? He was not in any of those logs, but it just paints a picture of what was happening in this region at the time. You have multiple boys disappearing, including in Revere. There's a very prominent case that I write about in the book about a young boy who disappeared in April of 1974, a mile away from where the sex ring was already operating. It was yet to be found. Just a couple years later, it was found. And it's one of the most notorious missing person cases in the history of the state. And it's the case of Lee Savoy, a little boy who went down to shine shoes at Suffolk Downs so he could get his mother an Easter present. And that boy disappeared, never to be seen again. And there's just a lot of meat on that bone for the town of Revere and the secrets that it harbors. And the average person on the street probably couldn't tell you one thing about it. And, something that I've heard on your show in the past is you had a gentleman on named Bob Hamer from the FBI,
sure,
a man that I interviewed a lot for this book. He infiltrated NAMBLA, which was the New York-based, Boston-based originally, but the New York chapter of NAMBLA, which is, of course, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. NAMBLA was created in a direct response to the Revere sex raid. They were all Massachusetts-based. They thought that these men that were caught up in this Revere sex ring, were being basically unfairly treated. It was a witch hunt on gay folks. Prominent gay activists like David Brill, David Thorstad, wrote books and magazine articles talking about the Revere sex ring. 22 of them got together, the original 22 as they're called, and basically did a outdoor protest at the Bridgewater State Hospital, the home for the sexually dangerous, which is where Wayne Chapman ended up, and all of these guys from the Revere sex case ended up. And they did one in 1978. They performed a protest outside of there. That night is when NAMBLA was formed. Everything that's happened since then regarding NAMBLA activity started that day. And in the book, you'll find the entire list, 22 names of who created the NAMBLA movement. And the second part of the book is really about NAMBLA crimes. And they've absolutely been what's the word I'm looking for? They're culpable in the death of multiple little boys across the United States. And we should never forget that. And we should really pay much more attention to that, because to this day, if you go to your computer and type in NAMBLA.org, I don't recommend doing it from home, but you will find that there's still NAMBLA message boards out there. And there's multiple families across the states, including the family of Jeffrey Curley here in Boston, who their children will never be seen again because they were murdered by card-carrying NAMBLA members. And it was created all in response to the Revere sex case here in 77.
Yeah, that Curly kid, wasn't he the one with the Lion King with the bicycle and stuff?
Yeah, so they basically, Salvatore Sicari, who was a literal card-carrying member. I don't mean that to be facetious. He had a card in his car that said NAMBLA member.
Yeah, and all his friends, too. They were all in on this. Everyone knew what was going on there, yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, he admitted that during his NAMBLA meetings, other men would basically encourage him to abduct and kill this young boy. So Jeffrey Curley's family ended up actually suing NAMBLA, the entity, and unfortunately was thrown out of court. But it's to this day, Salvatore Sicari continues to come up for parole every 5 years. They actually ended up promising him a bicycle, and then they brought him up to New Hampshire, and they dumped his body. And it all sort of played out over one day. There wasn't some big whodunit. They caught them pretty quickly, but it was less about the two men who did it and more about the apparatus behind them that pushed them to do it, and where that came from and why it started. That story has never been told until this book, Ed.
And they had a woman friend too that was aware of the whole plot going on as well. She was part of it.
I wouldn't say she was part of it. I think that's a little strong, but you would think that a woman who was friendly with them would step in to maybe help a small child. But, maybe those maternal instincts would kick in. But as I write in the book, and as I've said on my speaking and podcast engagements, I've seen women offend, and women definitely can offend sexually. I had one woman. I had a female prisoner at one point who I saw go down for 30 years because she was raping her own child, and it was a daughter. Which it's rare. It's obviously much less common than men, but it does happen. Absolutely.
I think it's rare, but I also think it's less suspected, so there's less suspicion, so they get away with more too as well. But that's just, and with this Cornelius Otero, when you got a priest involved, they take those confessions, you know what I mean, and they can gather who's coming in there to confess. Judges, the prosecutor, you know what I mean, coming in to confess to their parish priest, and this guy's got all that dirt, man. If he has a recorder on him, forget it,
Yep, right. Priests. Listen, I'm a lapsed Catholic.
Me too.
I will say that there was two priests who were involved in the original 22 NAMBLA members. Yeah. One of them was a pedophile priest named Paul Shanley, who is a very, very famous name in the circles of New England for how many boys he raped as a parish priest over a multiple decade career. And he just kept getting shipped around. And the Catholic Church and the Vatican would just, instead of meeting these allegations head on, they just moved him to a different parish and just hoped that people forgot about it or never knew or didn't bother to Google or look at newspapers, so that's what they did. And unfortunately for them, all of I think the last time I looked, they had paid out around $5.8 billion to Catholic Church to victims over the years. So I guess we'll have to wait for justice on the other side, Ed. But that is intertwined throughout this entire story.
Yeah, up on the Opera Report Patreon in the free section, I have that, I think it's a 400-page grand jury report for Pennsylvania. And the grand jury put together a 20-page summary in the beginning because they said, hey, there's a lot of material here. We want to summarize this to you because it's so important. And if you read this report, man, this was this was their main focus. This was their whole thing. I don't know. I had time to do anything else but chase after these little boys.
I know. And people say that one thing that I'm no psychologist. I'm not. I don't have a master's degree, but I have lived amongst and studied predators for the better part of my entire adult life. And I write about this, and it's a very important point to your audience, and I hope that they understand this when I say it. People believe that priests become pedophiles. I've heard this a million times. Because they're not allowed to have sex, they're not allowed to be married. Of course, there's all this pent-up energy. It's just not the case. The case is that people are born this way, and everything about
Fentanyl. It could be hiding anywhere, including in your house, including in your medicine cabinet, or maybe at a friend's house when you're hanging out, playing games, and get offered a pill. Don't take chances. If a drug didn't come from a pharmacy directly to you, you can find fentanyl using a simple strip you can pick up at your local pharmacy. Don't take it until you test it, because fentanyl can be hiding anywhere. Brought to you by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Mental Disabilities.
Their lives is how can they engage in their specific sexual proclivities. And becoming a priest gives you power, and it gets you close to children. That's why they pick those jobs. That's what it is. That's why it's your football coach, it's your high school teachers and middle school teachers, it's your priests. They pick these positions of powers because everything in their life is about their sexual proclivities, and that's their drive. That's their engine. That's all there is, Ed.
Yeah, and clearly the
It's
Catholic
important.
Church, these seminaries especially, they became a haven for these types. They were all into it. When you read the stories about what went on up there in Boston, that investigation, at the seminaries, they had posters of Menudo and boys bands on their walls. This wasn't something that was being hidden. It's just...
Yeah. It's institutional. People talk about, like, institutional racism, and I'm not shooting that down in any way.
Yeah.
I'm just, it's the similar thing in the Catholic Church. It was institutional for a long time, and I write in the book about a private boys' school in the town of Newton, Massachusetts, which is one of the richest towns in America, called the Fessenden School, and it was ran, all boys, getting people ready for elite jobs. These are your Goldman Sachs guys. These are your Harvard Law School guys, your next senators. And they were going to this elite boys' school, and all of their headmasters and teachers, they were having parties with them, on the weekends, feeding them drugs, alcohol, raping them, hanging them upside down, torturing them. And all these stories come from the survivors themselves. They find me, and then they tell me, and you hear the same story over and over again, and you just go, what the hell was going on in these times with these people? And that the Fessenden School story, while it's unrelated to the disappearances of these boys, is so important to painting the overall picture of what kids were running into in this region during that time.
Now, in our pre-interview, you were telling me about how tips are still coming in. You encourage tips to come in. How can people get a hold of you? Through Twitter and Instagram? Is that your preferred method?
Twitter, Instagram, just my first and last name, 11 BRAVO @gmail.com. Feel free to email me anytime, Dave McGrath 11 Bravo @gmail. Most of it comes through that. There's so much to cover. We probably covered 10% of the story, but the bottom line is somebody out there always knows something. And in the new book, there's a chapter called Unmasked. And in my first book, I had written about how I could never get the identity of a man who had confessed to a murder of a little boy, a 4-year-old boy named Andrew Amato in Massachusetts. It is a case that has long, been in my psyche as something that I just could not figure out. I could never get this name. Well, Ed, after I wrote the book, I just went on a YouTube show and talked about it much like this. Within an hour, I had a message in my inbox. The man who confessed to this murder and likely did it was my father. Wow. And turns out, she was absolutely telling me the truth, and I tell the whole story in the new book.
I got to tell you, it really is such a small world. And one time I stumbled at the story about Richard Beganwall, the serial killer, and how, we were in the middle of a marijuana deal, and he pulled out a shotgun and he pointed to the place where he buried the bodies and all this crazy stuff. And I got a message from the niece of one of my old buddies, one of my old pot smuggling buddies from Staten Island, who just got out of prison. He did 25 years in prison for marijuana, and he just got out. So it's such a small world. It's just unbelievable.
There's always somebody listening, and there's always somebody out there who knows something. So come forward and tell me something, because I'll be honest with you. As much as I say every time I do something on this, I just told myself as I was driving over here to do this interview with you, when this book comes out, I'm going to be done with this. Yeah. I'm done. I'm going to go on to something else. But I'll never truly be done. I'll be sitting here at 65, 70 years old. If nothing's resolved, saying, what more can I do? What more questions can I ask? I always feel like the next rock that you flip over is going to be like the answer. So, somebody out there may know something. If you do, please get in touch with me. That's my main message for today, for sure.
No, but what about the other side of the coin here? You're sticking your nose into all these people. There's obviously organized crime, Roy DeMeo. Any threats and intimidation coming against you here for exposing all this?
That's such a great question. Thank you for asking me that. So if I can take 5 more minutes to say, those of you who are listening to this show who are familiar with the Providence area are going to know about a sex store, how do I put this, an adult video store called Amazing. Now, you may have one in your hometown. Everybody, I'm not sure how prominent they are across the country, but there's one on every corner in Providence. And the creator and owner of the Amazing video stores was a man named Kenneth Borino. He was a made man underneath the Patriarca family, in Providence. He moved out to California now. He's big in the adult video business. He was indicted and did a jail stint, I should say, for being caught peddling, pushing, transporting reels and reels of child pornography. Okay, so I now know that Ken Guarino, a made mafia capo, had been caught peddling child porn. Where did that come from? Who created it? Men like Wayne Chapman created it, and they did it with your sons and daughters. Okay, mostly your sons, isolating them, getting them out of their social circles and then abusing them. So the connection to the mob is one that is so important, because without the funding, without the backing, without the customer base, none of this happens. And there's been times, to answer your question, Ed, in a roundabout way, there's at least one time where I've been summoned to a meeting. Just, you shouldn't be discussing this. You're sticking your nose in things that you shouldn't stick your nose in. We're trying to move on from that, where you just shut your mouth. There's been a lot of things. I don't want to go too much into it here, but the mob connection is very real. It's not something that I've connected dots on. It's something that you can find in FBI documents if you care to read. This all began when child porn got pushed down into the New England area, and all of these freaks, for lack of a better term, came with it because they're low-level foot soldiers, and they needed to produce it. They needed to get it out into the mass market because it was a millions of dollars industry, even in the 1970s, Ed. And that's where it all started. You couldn't sell a cigarette on the corner in Providence in the 1970s without the mob taking some of it. And they didn't care if it was child porn or construction. They were going to do it. So it's all intertwined.
Yeah, and people who glamorize these organized crime figures, The Godfather, even Francis Ford Coppola himself, went out of his way to help assist Victor Silva, who was convicted of raping one of the stars of his movie there, a little babysitter kid, and tried to get him a release from furlough from prison to attend one of the premieres of his movies. So, this glamorous stuff, I've never seen that. Now, we're talking to private investigator David McGrath. The book is called Obsessed: A Survivor's Quest.
I could just take you... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead, Ed. I'm sorry. If I could just make one statement on you mentioned about the glorification of the mob. Now, I'm from Boston, and we have a pretty famous mob figure in Boston named James Whitey Bulger. And Jimmy Bulger had a movie called Black Mass made about him, where Johnny Depp, a very famous actor, played him. And he said, I don't think real evil exists. And this is his words, not mine. Someone asked him, was Whitey Bulger evil? And he said, I don't think so. Evil doesn't exist in this world. Now, this is a man who would strangle women and pluck their teeth out with pliers, and he was a known pedophile, absolutely did horrific things to underage women. And it's just despicable that in our culture that these guys, after shows like The Sopranos and Goodfellas and movies like that, that these people are put on some sort of pedestal as if this is legitimate way to live your life, and this is something that should be shunned from polite society. So I really appreciate you saying that, because we have a huge problem with that here in Boston, for sure.
Yeah, and Johnny Depp is no saint himself. Okay, his connection to West Memphis 3. And I've seen the full Johnny Depp PI report. Paul Baresi, who worked for Amber Heard, then went to work for John Barrett. Anyway, we'll get into that on another occasion when PI Dave McGrath comes back. But once again, the book is called Obsessed: A Survivor's Quest to Find Justice for the Lost Boys of New England. Check him out on Substack, Dave McGrath on Substack. Twitter and Instagram is Dave M11 Bravo, number 11 Bravo. And I'm going to have you come back and tell us all about Seth Rich. I know you're working on a whole series about Seth Rich. We got 1 minute. You want to tell us in 1 minute, Seth Rich?
Okay, so a lot of people are going to say, listen, my work on Seth Rich is, but it's the most consequential murder of the 21st century. Without Seth Rich, you don't have Donald Trump as your president in 2016. You have Bernie Sanders as your president in 2016. He would have beaten Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and you would have had charted a different course for this entire country. Why was Seth Rich killed, and why are people covering it up? Because the Democratic Party, and I am not a partisan, I am a total fierce independent. I don't like Democrats. I despise Republicans. I really don't like any of these people. But the bottom line is, you can't even ask a question. You can't even ask a question without being destroyed on the front page of the Washington Post or amongst most regular corporate journalists. When you ask about a robbery where a man's Rolex and wallet and cell phone were left behind, and he was undoubtedly the leak of the 2016 Hillary emails that showed that they rigged the primary against Bernie Sanders. Debbie Wasserman Seltz, the head of the DNC, was fired over it. Donna Brazile, who ran Hillary Clinton's campaign, wrote in her memoirs that after Seth Rich was murdered, she hired private security and shut her windows and her blinds every night. This is a family that has absolutely no answers as to why their son was murdered, and they're lying to you about it. And it is the most important murder of the 21st century, and nobody's done anything on it. And I plan to do something this summer. 6 episodes, Seth Rich. What happened? That's all.
Private investigator Dave McGrath. The book is called Obsessed, A Survivor's Quest to Find Justice for the Lost Boys of New England. You can meet him in person January 19th or February 24th, Providence Library, 150 Empire Street at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Check out his Substack and also on Instagram and Twitter at DaveM11Bravo. Mr. McGrath, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ed. Merry Christmas, buddy.
Good night, sir.
Fentanyl. It could be hiding anywhere, including in your house, including in your medicine cabinet, or maybe at a friend's house when you're hanging out, playing games, and get offered a pill. Don't take chances. If a drug didn't come from a pharmacy directly to you, you can find fentanyl using a simple strip you can pick up at your local pharmacy. Don't take it until you test it, because fentanyl can be hiding anywhere. Brought to you by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Mental Disabilities. Fentanyl. It could be hiding anywhere, including in your house, including in your medicine cabinet, or maybe at a friend's house when you're hanging out, playing games, and get offered a pill. Don't take chances. If a drug didn't come from a pharmacy directly to you, you can find fentanyl using a simple strip you can pick up at your local pharmacy. Don't take it until you test it, because fentanyl can be hiding anywhere. Brought to you by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Mental Disabilities.